Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations about LM Montgomery, the Emily of New Moon Round Table. Our moderator today will be Benjamin Lefebvre, and our chat moderator will be Caroline Jones. Before we begin, I would like to read the land acknowledgement for my area, and I would ask that you think about land acknowledgement for yours. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which we are located. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area in which I live, known as Tikaronto, has been caretaken by the Ashinabek Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuits, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenants, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I would like to go into the technical aspects very briefly indeed. Throughout the round table today, if you have a question, there are two ways to ask it. You can go to reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you can put up your virtual hand, or if you have access to the online chat, you may type your question directly into the online chat. Our chat moderator today, Caroline Jones, is well known in Montgomery study circles for having published a number of articles. Our moderator today, Benjamin Lefebvre, needs no introduction. Anyone who studies Montgomery has seen his names on multiple books, some of them award-winning articles, and has met him as the co-chair of conferences. At this time, I will turn things over to Ben to introduce our speakers and to get things going. So welcome everyone, and over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Andrea, and it's great to see all these familiar faces after a summer away. And so welcome everyone. So I'm very pleased to moderate this roundtable on Emily of New Moon, which is a book that we just finished discussing on the Ella Montgomery readathon that Andrea and I co-curate on Facebook. And there's been a lot of really fascinating and in-depth discussions of that book in that forum. So I'm very happy that our three speakers today will be giving us tools to think about the novel in exciting new ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by introducing all three of the speakers today, and then I will ask each of them in turn to speak for a couple of minutes about their topic, and then we'll have follow-up questions, and they are also will have the opportunity to ask questions of each other, and then we will just kind of carry on from there with questions from you in the audience as well. So first off is Kate Sutherland, who's an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto. Kate teaches and conducts research in the areas of tort law, law and literature, and feminist legal theory. Her law and literature publications include 3 articles on different aspects of Ella Montgomery's life and work. She's also the author of 4 books of fiction and poetry, most recently a collection of poems entitled The Bones Are There. And Kate's topic today is Lessons in Law in Emily of New Moon. Next, we will hear from E. Holly Pike, who recently has retired from the faculty of the English program at Memorial University's Grenfell campus. Her contributions to Montgomery scholarship have appeared in Journal of Ella Montgomery Studies and in several collections of essays, including the forthcoming volume Ella Montgomery and Gender, which she co-edited with Laura M. Robinson. That will be out in November. Her current project is a volume entitled Children and Childhoods in Ella Montgomery, Continuing Conversations, which she is co-editing with Rita Bode, Leslie Clement, and Margaret Steffler. And Holly will be talking about age values in Emily of New Moon. And finally, we have Brenton Dickieson, who is a writer, a researcher, and a teacher as well as the host of Modcast, which is the podcast of the Ella Montgomery Institute. Originally from New Glasgow, Prince Edward Island, he grew up playing in Montgomery's Cavendish backyards, but did not discover her books until adulthood. His research considers how the creation of stories contributes to conversations about spirituality, theology, and cultural criticism, which he explores in his blog, A Pilgrim in Narnia. He was awarded the Elizabeth R. Epperly Award for Early Career Paper in 2020 for his essay entitled Befriending the Darkness, Ella Montgomery's Lived Theodicy in Anne's House of Dreams. And Brenton will be talking about a recent Megan Follows audiobook version of Emily of New Moon. So let's start this off with Kate, who will be talking about lessons in law in this novel. Take it away, Kate.
Thank you, Ben. So you may be immediately wondering, where does law come into it? This is not a novel peopled by lawyers and judges. There's no courtroom scene. There's no crime at the center of the novel. But law and literature scholars, particularly when they're focused on texts enjoyed by child readers, define law very broadly. They're interested in children's literature as a vehicle for developing legal consciousness in children and socializing them for citizenship. And generally this happens not by exposure to statutes or court cases, but rather consideration of rules, norms, conventions, the communication of those, learning about right and wrong. So what do such scholars find in different texts read by children? Of course, it depends on the text, but there tends to be sort of two strands to that. One that sees a lot of children's literature as offering up didactic lessons in law about, adhering to authority and so on. But there's another strand that actually sees a lot of potential for subversion in these texts, looking at how the individuality of children might be celebrated, about their defiance of authority when sort of official rules violate their sense of morality might be celebrated. So where does Emily of New Moon fit into all of this? Well, it seems to me to be very much a novel about this kind of socialization. Emily starts the book a bit of a wild child in the house in the hollow with her father, but getting some education, but not going to school, rarely going to church, not receiving much exposure to societal convention, or not having respect for that communicated to her. And then by the end of the book, after a few years at New Moon under the tutelage of Aunt Elizabeth, she's a respectable young woman with lengthened skirts who knows all there is to know about Murray traditions and mostly adheres to them. So that makes it actually sound like the didactic lessons in adhering to authority, but of course, those of us who've read the book, which I'm sure is all of us, know it's much more complicated than that. There is here some of that celebration of defiance of authority when her own moral code is trampled on by the authority figures and by the rules. But there's also a lot of really interesting kind of in-betweens or beyonds of those poles. So when I look at this book through that law and literature lens, I really focus on the relationship between Emily and Aunt Elizabeth and what Emily learns from Aunt Elizabeth over the course of the novel. And I see her sometimes a willing pupil, wanting things that she didn't know and being mortified that she didn't know things were wrong and wanting to correct them. I see her sometimes disagreeing with Aunt Elizabeth's ideas about what's right and wrong, but still accepting Aunt Elizabeth's authority, saying she's the head of the household. I have to obey her. I can't sort of sneakily resist some of the things she's forbidden me from doing, as Aunt Laura sometimes suggests that she does. She doesn't see that as being right. But other times we see the outright defiance. Aunt Elizabeth says the kitten must be drowned. Emily says that's wrong. This vulnerable creature will not be drowned. But we also have moments, and this is when it gets really interesting for me, when I start to see Emily not learning lessons in law, but teaching them. And again, this is the complex evolving relationship between Emily and Aunt Elizabeth. And this really culminates for me in the what I see as the kind of climactic scene of the book, when Aunt Elizabeth finds and reads Emily's letters to her father, expects Emily to be chastened and contrite, and then Emily is outraged that her privacy has been violated in this way. And ultimately, she comes around to convincing Aunt Elizabeth that what she did was in fact wrong. So there's all this really interesting back and forth, which I think makes this book a really interesting one to look at through a legal lens, both to enrich the law and literature field in terms of different texts that tell us interesting things about how children learn about rules and right and wrong and so on, but also a different lens for us to think about the relationship between Emily and Aunt Elizabeth. And of course, other authority figures too, but Aunt Elizabeth is sort of the main one who takes on the job of socializing Emily and fitting her for her societal role, given the family she's from, the class that she's from, the gender that she is, and so on. I could go into great detail about all of my incidents, but I've already gone beyond my few minutes, so I won't. But I'll be really interested to see what people make of that idea and what incidents from the book they might come up with to think about that relationship between Emily and Aunt Elizabeth and who learns what from who. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Kate. That's great. And yeah, as you said, there's a lot more to talk about, which is wonderful. Okay, so next, Holly will be talking about age and how that is valued, or the complicated way that is valued in the novel. So
yeah,
Holly.
All right, thanks, Ben. And thanks, Kate, for yeah, because I can see connections already, of course. Yeah, what started me thinking about age and just things as well as people being old is I got a new copy of Emily of New Moon. And, when you read a new copy of a book, you see everything differently, or that might only be me, so that's fine. But I noticed in the conversation with Mr. Carpenter at the end, where he's reading her work, he says, "What do you know of the hungry world, you in your new moon seclusion of old trees and old maids?" And it was that conjunction, old trees and old maids, that made me think, old trees and old maids? Like, what's the connection? Like, how are they connected? And when you go back, or when I go back, sorry, I'm not trying to make you say that you all agree with me on this. When I went back through the book, then thinking about old trees first and then old maids, that really is a connection that's made. When you look at the way New Moon is described, and embowered in trees, the trees, there's a place where the trees are described as having a relationship with the family. Now, I took notes of all this stuff to try to remind myself. Yeah, so when she first comes to New Moon, Emily sees the trees, and this is the line: "Tall old trees, no mushroom growth of yesterday's birches, but trees that had loved and been loved by 3 generations." So there's this relationship between the trees and the family. And to me, I started to think about all the ways that people and things are referred to as old in the book. And they're clustered around a couple of things. There's New Moon, the old stone dike, the old orchard versus the new orchard, the old summer house. Like, the word old is just attached to all these things. Aunt Elizabeth is worried that Emily wouldn't want to live with 3 old people. And then there's a parallel to that, it seems to me at least, with Wither Grange, where again, old women. Now, only one of them's an old maid, one's an old widow, but still this emphasis on old, but they have completely different values attached to them, because Aunt Laura and Aunt Elizabeth end up, and I agree with Kate on this, like being the positive forces, especially Aunt Elizabeth, who's teaching Emily things. Aunt Nancy and Caroline, who are an old demon and an old hag and abominable and all these things, are also teaching her things, and they're both teaching her different kinds of family history. But the ones who are teaching her the sort of harsh view of family history are abominable and a hag and so on, whereas the ones who are teaching her, along with cousin Jimmy, the traditions, they're a good kind of old, right? So when I started to think about it in terms of just the word old, it started to have all these different meanings to me, and I just wonder how other people see that too.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ali. Okay, so our third speaker today, Brenton, the reason I thought of him when we put together this roundtable is that on the readathon Facebook group, he started to mention that earlier this year, a new audiobook version of Emily of New Moon came out with Megan Follows, of all people, reading out the book. And Brenton read it, which is to say he listened to it. And he didn't want to say too much because we hadn't reached a part of the book that was key to one of the things he had discovered in the audiobook. But he said enough to maybe think, oh, I want, because I'm always interested in adaptations and abridgments and new iterations of Montgomery texts. I thought, well, I want to know more of what he's found. So that's one of the reasons that we asked him to be here today, because I was really curious about what he had found about this abridgment. So Brenton, what did you end up discovering?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, you think of Megan Follows, I think of the 1980s Kevin Sullivan films, and then later Continuing Story. And I just she's sort of the voice of Anne for me in a lot of ways, I think. And so it was a bit weird picking up Emily of New Moon and listening to initially sort of a venerable Anne voice coming out, because even I guess actors age apparently. And so, but I was interested. She had done a really kind of quite nice and creepy version of Lefebvre's vampire classic, Camilla. And so I really quite liked her voice in that. So I picked up the book, and it was going along with the readathon. And I'd made that adjustment. It kind of brought some Anne-like things for Emily out for me. Some of the ways that she kind of awakens and turns things upside down within the New Moon setting, and then sometimes also later in her school and community. But as I was going through, I realized there was just kind of something wrong with this text, and it was just missing things. And in the end, I'm just going to briefly explain some of the things that are missing in the abridgment. An abridgment is obviously it's going to be much shorter. In this case, by my rough estimate, it's just under half, about 48.7 or 8% of the text. That's not scientific, it's just an estimate. And so you're cutting a lot. So I mean, what do you cut when you do an abridgment? And ultimately what they did was cut a number of things. So just briefly, and we can talk about any of them in some detail. What I missed a lot of was the experiences of the Flash. Not so much, usually it's mentioned that the Flash happens, but what we lose is what the Flash does for Emily, how early on it gives her courage and hope to meet her new family and kind of be herself within them. Later on, it carries her energetically through her school experiences. At another point, it's missing the escape that it provides her on her first night in Aunt Elizabeth's house. So it's missing those elements of the Flash, and not just the experience, but kind of what the experience does. A second thing is Emily's letters to her father grow really thin. Okay, and I think we might think in Emily Climbs that there's sometimes a little too much reliance on the epistolary aspect, but we don't think that. I don't think most of us in Emily of New Moon, even if it's occasionally indulgent, like the spelling and things like that. But it's Emily's voice in this book. That's how we get to Emily's voice, more than in the dialogue or by the narrator, where we get great things about her character. And so we miss quite a lot of her voice when we lose those letters. We also miss a little bit of that fatherly connection. Connected to that is that God is edited out of the abridgment. Okay, I mean, not totally, but almost all the non-humorous references to God are taken out, including that great kind of contrasting of Father's God with Ellen Green's God, the question of whether Aunt Elizabeth's God is the same kind of thing. All of Emily's doubts and worries about God are taken out. The great comments about the character of God, like that Aunt Elizabeth think are irreverent, but I think are actually importantly subversive, to go back to Kate's point there. And we have those great moments that she speaks with such sort of theological sophistication for a child. Like Emily hadn't any idea what Father's God was like, but she was determined not to be posed by Ellen. He is clear as the moon, fair as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners, she said triumphantly. That's quite a statement. She is a psalmist in her thinking about God, and that's pretty much all gone from the book, including the debates between her and Ilse about God, because and most of the stuff about Dr. Burnley being an infidel, but not all of it. And then finally, chapters 22 to 26 are entirely erased. Entirely. And just so you know what that is the entire Wither Grange, Dean Priest, Emily's encounter with death, Dean Priest friendship. That whole cycle's gone. In fact, except for the Father Cassidy, the actual priest, all the priest references are gone from the text as far as I tell. I don't have a transcription, so I can't do an exact side-by-side comparison, but they're pretty much all gone. Like almost entirely gone. And so what do you lose? I mean, like jeepers, that whole encounter with Caroline and Nancy Priest, the whole Dean Priest cycle is gone, right? Including all that kind of stuff that happens and Emily's recovery at the end of the book, right? Which is largely connected because her playmates all have measles. She's largely kind of brought kind of out of her room and herself with Dean Priest. So this is sort of interesting. This is an interesting thing. And so I think we get kind of this happens with the abridgment. One is that there's a complex of kind of cool realities for Emily that end up being split up in the book. So that, that fierce, mystical, interrelated reality of the Flash, wonder, joy, the numinous artistry, beauty, all that stuff, as it combines with sort of curiosity, spiritual curiosity, the world testing questions, her child theological mind, her rugged ethics, her rugged kind of fierce friendship. So those are connected, but then they're also connected to Emily's ability to see, perceive, including the psychic stuff, and her innate literary ability to bring something to life that's combined with her vocation. Those things that are all connected in Emily sort of come apart a little bit. So they end up being aspects of her personality, not some kind of complex whole. And then we also lose the tensions that the priests begin, the learning. Remember, Emily grows up, right? Because she goes off to Wither Grange and all those things happen. But in the text, the abridgment, she grows up because the summer passed, right? It's a little different. That's quite a different striking thing. And so the two things that I think come out is that we get the lessening of the mystical and the artistic and that kind of connected things. But we also get, I think, what is a really intentional abridgment. So not just the necessities of space, is an intentional cutting out of the conversations about God and Dean Priest. Now that's quite a combination. So that's what we get as a result of this abridgment.
Okay, thanks, Brenton. So the reason that I found, well, one of the reasons I find all this fascinating is that although I don't have a copy of the actual abridgment, but on the website, the official website from the abridgment, the audiobook publisher, there is no indication that it is abridged at all, let alone by 47, 48%, which is pretty significant.
Yeah,
right?
no, it's a more than half abridgment. So like more than half of the text is cut out, including, I've not seen that very often, like a 4-chapter cycle. And so, I mean, like, how would you possibly do a follow-up? Like,
I don't know how you could, but I also wonder how then. So sorry for, well, we've already finished another readathon, so we're done with spoilers here. But how do they solve the mystery of Ilse's mother then if that whole sequence is cut out?
Yeah, she's not terribly worried about it. Like she's just not that worried about it. She like encounters the idea from geez, how did it happen? I have it in my notes, but I think it's she overhears Aunt Laura, and then they combine that text with they combine that somehow with the Aunt Laura and Aunt Elizabeth overspeak conversation. So I have to go back. I wrote that down, but I have to find that out and find out how that happens. But I was thinking once I picked a path, I kind of went back and went through it again this week to think about it from that perspective. But yeah, and so she knows that. So she just, like, that tension that builds in Emily that's kind of put in every 20 paragraphs or so through the last quarter of the book is not there. And so we end up with, like, she knows that it can't be that bad. And then we have that issue. And then all of a sudden she's got the psychic experience and the measles. So
So not only then is this an abridgment in the sense of like somebody taking a red pen and going tick, 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 but it's also an adaptation if they are combining conversations. Yeah, I have very limited experience with audiobook versions, but I've never heard of one that adapts it to this extent or cuts it to this extent without saying so.
Yeah, well, so like when you buy it, if you buy from Audible or something, you'll see that it says abridged in the title. So,
Okay.
Or it does now. When I bought it, I didn't notice it. But it says like in the first few seconds, like, welcome to the abridged recording of. And so it's not like I didn't feel cheated, like in the sense of like I spent whatever it was, $10, right? I felt cheated in that, what did you do to the book, right? Like that's where I felt cheated. But I'm a little anti-abridgment anyway. So somebody who loves this, what we would find, Ben, with a full cast like dramatization, we might find rewriting in an abridgment, but it's unusual to see. So they'll move a paragraph around, at least twice I found. They moved a paragraph around and then they add things to make sense of that. And officially, you could probably find those words elsewhere. So you could probably make just a ... abridgment in a lot of it, but not all of it. There's some movement. And that's, I think, a little bit unusual in large, like in publisher directed abridgments. However, since January 2018, this is an open text globally. And we have now, at least 7, full unabridged readings that are available. So,
yeah. But obviously, the fact that Megan follows is the narrator. I mean, this one there'll be a big draw for that.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think ties all 3 topics together is the question of target audience. So Kate, you were mentioning you were mentioning that usually in children's literature, there's the more didactic element in terms of law, like right and wrong as a kind of very clear binary. But of course, in this book, it's a lot more messy than that. But although you refer to Emily New Moon as a book that's read by children, one of the eternal questions, especially for me, is who did Montgomery write this for, right? So, but even if we can't answer that question about whether this book really is children's literature or not, it is still read by children, but also read by adults. So how is that kind of dual dance that we always have with target audience, or at least actual audience, how might that be yet another complication in terms of the version of law that's explored in the novel?
I think the parts about it that I find most interesting when, as I said, the lessons start going the other way and Emily starts teaching Aunt Elizabeth things, that actually, really strengthens the case that it's not just a book for children. I'm thinking of the sort of rereading of Anne of Green Gables as being a book not about Anne growing up, but a book about Marilla evolving. And I think that you could say the same thing in Emily of New Moon, that it's a book about Emily, but it's also a book about Aunt Elizabeth and how she shifts over time. And Aunt Elizabeth as a central focus is not going to be of a great deal of interest to children, I don't think, child readers, but it's of enormous interest, certainly to me, and I would think to a lot of adult readers. So that nuance and that complication, I think, makes it very interesting to a broad audience.
Yeah. And Holly, you mentioned that, you had bought a new edition of the book, and the new edition made you see the book in a new way. And I'm thinking, my guess is that if the new edition that you bought is a recent reprint, then it would be one that is more explicitly geared toward child readers. Like this is the set of editions that it's the only set of editions, a full set of Montgomery editions that's ever existed in North America, and it's from the 80s and 90s. But even though I remember seeing these books in the children's classic sections, I mean, the Seal imprint was basically a mass market imprint. It wasn't geared toward children at all, whereas recent editions from Tundra and even Virago, there's a Tundra edition. It's very much, this is a children's book. So that means that the cover art, the margins, the font size, those are all adjusted with a different target audience in mind. So what does that mean then in terms of this shift from an apparent general audience versus child audience in terms of what you're exploring with age and the notion of old?
Well, I think that it's pretty much similar to what Kate was saying, because yes, it is the Tundra edition that I got. And yes, big print, wider margins, clearly aimed for the young audience, as opposed to my old little seal bantam, whichever it was. It's an ancient one. Like, it was at the point where I turned a page and the page came out. So when I got this new one, as I said, I saw everything differently, just because everything was in a different relationship to each other on the page. But I think when I started rereading it about things being old, I ended up with the same notion that Kate has, that the book isn't just about Emily, and it's not just about childhood. So this, I mean, one of the references early on about New Moon is that it's still a vivid and living home, that it hasn't succumbed to the old maidishness of Elizabeth and Laura, hasn't entirely succumbed, or some word like that, to the old maidishness. It's not, no, its vivid lives are not yet banished by the old maidishness, that's hard to say, of the regime of Elizabeth and Laura. And that's not phrasing that would convey anything particular to a child, I don't think. But if a child does have a conception of an old maid, as Kate said, Aunt Elizabeth is learning throughout the book. And the Aunt Elizabeth who responds to Emily over the burning of, or over the letter bills, for instance, is not an old maid. You know, she's an authority figure. And if you, and I don't know, like, does anyone even use the phrase old maid anymore? Like, except in a card game? I don't think so. So, you know, you give this to a contemporary 10-year-old or 11-year-old to read, and they're probably just blurring past that, because old maid is not going to convey anything to them. But to the adult reader, especially to a reader, you know, who at my age, you know, for whom an old maid actually was still a concept, you know, and I had an old great aunt who we referred to as an old maid, right? So to me, yeah, so to the adult reader, like, I'm trying to imagine a new adult reader of it now, and what concept a new adult reader is going to apply to old maidishness and the connection between old trees and old maids. Because to me, in the end, that ends up suggesting ongoing growth, ongoing connection, a rootedness, a solidity, you know, and nurture and shade, because of the way trees are used in the novel as a whole, and, you know, later in the other books too. And I just don't know, you know, how other people will read it. But anyway, to get back to your point, yeah, I think it's an adult book. I think it's a book for adults.
Well, I personally think any series that ends in a book like Emily's Quest has to be for adults, but that's
And
the thing.
you know, just thinking about what Brenton was talking about, like, how the hell can you leave out Dean? It just doesn't make any sense.
Can I actually follow up, Ben, on that? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's just a super perceptive question and then a response, because, I mean, if you think about like how we know that Montgomery wanted to write something that was different, right? That it wasn't like, that wasn't a children's book, and yet she wrote what is often read as and can be read as a children's book. But is there like a word for children's books that aren't children's books in the way, like closet children's books, like the way that plays can be closet plays that are written really not for the stage but for reading? And you know, and this happens all the time. I think of Lois Lowry's The Willoughbys. After writing all these kind of young adult and children's books, she writes what's clearly not, even though it's got all the same feeling and texture and language. And I think we have this here, and I think she does it through thinking about you know, Holly's idea of old and young. I think she does it through that a strange kind of inversion of old and young. Think about Emily early on. Ellen Green says, you're just, you know, you're queer, you're wrong, you're too old for your age, right? And then Jimmy, who appears to be younger than he is, but then has this other kind of rooted wisdom and is just the right person in a lot of ways. I think that she plays with old and young in a way to create for us a book that, yeah, it can be marketed and sold as a children's book. I think lots of kids would read this book, boys and girls, but I think it's a great adult read.
But but in terms of the abridgment, so one of the things that wouldn't be apparent if you just downloaded it on Audible, but when I saw the version of it on the website is that as a physical object, it actually looks, it's the size of a picture book. So it seems to be targeting even a much younger reader than the Tundra edition that Holly was showing, which is the kind of usual 9 to 12 children's classic age. So I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of the strategies, like, well, let's erase Dean and let's erase God and let's erase all this conflict in order, because this must be a children's book, or this must, we need to make it a children's book the way we understand that term now. What do you make of target, like who would you say the target audience is of this audiobook?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, the way it's pitched, the way it's like drawn on the screen, it's certainly a children's book, but it's not like it doesn't lead in, like, Audible's not setting it up in Canada, for example, as like part of their children's section, as one of their root books, which surprises me. I think Canadian readers in general, and I think it's an Anne with an E coattails sort of publication as well. I think that it reads really well as a children's book in a lot of ways because of Megan Follows. I almost said Anne has this almost a maternal voice, but it's like a godmotherly maternal, not like a look down upon you maternal, or like let's get you ready for school maternal. It's a it does have a touch of the whimsy in it, and so I think it could be that, and that would make sense about cutting Dean Priest, an incredibly complex character, dark and abiding, aboding. No, that's abiding, boding, overboating. I don't have a word. Presence, right? I have a great quotation here from Betsy Epperly, if we want, but like it's just such a great tension throughout this free book. It's a great problem as a character, and like almost you wonder how she pulled that off, and whether she did sometimes, and then he's just gone, so now children can read it. So girls, like it's pretty creepy, right? Like the whole I own you, like you're in mine now, that's a pretty
yeah, definitely. So it's not surprising if they think, okay, this is now for children, or we need to make this for children, or at least have that as part of the audience, that there's really no way to salvage this character. So Caroline, I'd like to turn this over to you now, because I see a lot of activity in the chat. And so I wondered if there are some specific questions or comments that people have made to the topics that the three speakers are discussing.
Absolutely. I want to start with Daniela's question for Kate. Daniela points out that there are, in addition to the general right and wrong and moral learning of Emily, there are some more very specific, explicitly legal issues, which I'm so glad that she raised, because I was like, oh yeah. Perry wants to be a lawyer. He wants to go into government where they make the laws. There's a reference to Lofty John's lawful property. So we've got the property rights, but there's also the laws of fairness, which you talked about earlier, laws of pleasure, which are really interesting considering the Elizabeth, Nancy, Laura, Jimmy dynamic, the papal law, which Emily, of course, kind of goes beyond Murray law to find out about. So Kate?
Yeah, I thought a lot about, because I was using Elizabeth to personify law, it's a kind of informal law, and I was thinking a lot about gender there. So the idea that, I mean, Perry's just the hired boy at this point, but you already have a sense, even if you haven't read the rest, you know, him wanting to be a lawyer and wanting to go into government, you sort of, I mean, law is usually coded male, right? And so you think of, but Elizabeth is the representative because she's the head of the household, but you know, the real law behind the Murrays still feels like Archibald Murray for me, which is why the Murray look can vanquish her, because it's like she's being vanquished by her father. So there's lots of interesting things to me about gender and law there. And I think, you know, Perry's trajectory raises interesting things. But the other thing is that often law and morality are the two things that are being counterposed. And with the Lofty John's Bush, you know, he says legally he can do whatever he likes with it. But there's a point somewhere else in the book where they say, well, legally it's his, but morally it belongs to New Moon. So there's this idea in all kinds of places that even though ideally one would want law and justice and fairness all to go together, that law, at least official law, the, you know, societal law that has the sort of weight of authority behind it, often does seem to depart from morality. And all the different gods that end up being edited out of the abridgment is interesting, because I, you know, when I wrote this up in an academic context, I was thinking about natural law and positive law, and I didn't want to go deep here today with not much time into all kinds of legal theory, but the idea is that positive law is human created law, so it's the law of the state. Natural law is a higher law, and it's often associated with religion and religious values. And when Emily is willing to take Elizabeth on, it's often because sort of morality trumps societal convention in some way. So thank you for that question, Daniela, because it just, I mean, I can't resolve any of it, but it raises all kinds of interesting questions and multiple laws in the same way that there are multiple gods, I think.
Yes, and I hope that maybe you'll continue mulling over this and maybe share more of your thoughts with us in future in some venue, because that is just fascinating. I'm seeing a lot on the omission, and we really kind of got off on a tangent of, you know, reading for children, reading for adults. Beth points out that Montgomery tended to write for herself, but also perhaps the sort of thing she would have liked to have read, herself as a child reader, but also herself as an adult. And I think that, and Alexandra pointed out also that a lot of Montgomery's work does this. I think we see it, well, I think all Montgomery's work does this, has that very clear dual narrative. Part of it is intended for the child, for whom we market it primarily, and to whom we're supposed to be selling it. But of course, you always have to sell it. Mostly it's not the children in the bookstore with the money, it's the adults. And so we have the adults who are finding their own connections with it. And I am so much more sympathetic to Aunt Elizabeth than I ever was as a child. And I'm one of the fortunate few or many, I don't know. I am fortunate enough to have read it as a child. And I was never creeped out by the Dean stuff. But today I understand that's just, it's a different world. But also I believe children tend to read and they fixate on the things that they understand, the things that they are, that they have connection with. And most kids wouldn't have a Dean experience. I read it as a friend of her father's. I read it initially as a connection to her dad. And for me, that was a positive thing. You know, I always knew that he wasn't intended really to be a good guy, because there was the ownership thing, and there was the very cryptic, I think I'll wait for you, that sort of thing. I knew that there was something else going on, but I didn't much care what it was. But it signaled to me only, this is going to be complicated. Let me see. Yeah, because lots of us have spoken out about the creep factor on Dean.
But Carolyn, can I say something?
Please.
I was thinking about Dean and the creep factor, which is certainly there. And like you, when I read it in childhood, I wasn't fully aware of it, though I certainly am now. But, you know, omitting Dean is also omitting one of the old characters. I mean, when Emily first encounters him, he's her father's age. She thinks of him as venerable. That's the word, venerable. You know, he's of a venerable age. Now, he's not really worthy of any kind of veneration, as we know. But the other thing that Dean is associated with, you know, I said that Aunt Elizabeth and Cousin Jimmy and Aunt Laura teach her the traditions in the positive sense of New Moon. And Aunt Nancy and Caroline teach her the seamier side of those same stories, probably. Dean teaches her old stories too. If you look at the things that Dean talks to her about, it's the stuff of the old pagan gods, old stories, old Egypt, old Rome, old Greece. Like it just goes on and on. Everything is old that's associated with Dean, except for there's this weird thing that when she's recovering from measles, they watch a young moon become old together. So he's with her through a phase of the moon while everyone else is going through the measles. And that's how it's described. That's how the period of time is a young moon becoming old. Now, I do want to attach way too much importance to that, of course, but it's this whole thing about part of Dean's value to her is that he's old, that he has access to all this tradition that's outside of what the old maids amongst the old trees at New Moon can teach her, but that it's also weird stuff and that it involves bringing her along with him into some kind of aging process. And there's also the thing about him feeling, it's a Rip Van Winkle reference where he says he feels like he's going to wake up and find himself an old man with the skeleton of his dog beside him. So there's this weird aging thing associated with Dean, and it's associated with the old gods. So it's part of what Brenton was saying about leaving out every aspect of religion. So you leave out Dean, you're leaving out a hell of a lot.
Yes, a lot that, I mean, that's really interesting because if I don't know who was the publisher of the audio abridgment?
Yeah, it's a couple of groups, including Chatham's. They have an acting group. What is it? I have it here. Chatham, Ontario-based Voices in the Wind Audio Theatre, and then there's one other group that's connected as well. So it's a combination group.
I feel like if they do follow up with the other two books in the series, we'll have an entirely different narrative.
It sounds though like it's a lot of the old gets cut out, but a lot of the young gets cut out too. If Emily's child voice goes, and I was thinking about that when Ben was asking about who's the abridgment for, Emily's child voice is the most directed at child readers part of it. So if the letters with Emily's child voice in it are edited out, it's like we're losing both ends. We're losing our high end and our low end. The bass is gone,
Well, revision's
Yeah.
revision. Like, I mean, you're cutting out a lot. I mean, it was my son's first experience of discovering a book that wasn't good. I think I just picked up like one of the travel books, the water travel versions. We just pulled it off the kids' shelf and sat down, and we just started laughing about how the story was being told, how terrible it was. And so then we pulled out the real one. We didn't even finish it. And I think that's, someone had mentioned that classics often get adapted that way or edited that way, and I think I mean, this is more careful, like it's not careless. My concern is the kind of care that it shows is really telling. The Dean Priest cut, the religious or God or curiosity cut, as I would define it, and that's certainly a shaping of culture that's really telling, because I think that's beyond just simply we need to make this shorter so it fits in this many cardboard, this wide a cardboard box. So
Yeah, Laura pointed out that it's the cuts made in this audio version are very similar to to the cuts made in some of the Nordic translations, which are in fact, and part of me, I was a bookseller for many, many years, and goes straight back to that, is like, what can we market? What can we sell? But also to the role that that publishers have in shaping culture, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, they do. And so it's like, let's make it as inoffensive as possible so we can sell it to as many people as possible. But we've also stripped it of nuance. We've stripped it of, by stripping it of controversy, you make it boring. And you don't give your reader much to critically think about, which is just so sad. I'm looking at some of my.
It's just briefly, it's also a question of diversity, I think. Are we willing to hear other voices, even if they're voices that we feel as a culture we've left behind? And it's a kind of arrogance of our particular point of view, what someone has called chronological snobbery, I think, to simply cut out what is uncomfortable for us. So we're always curating books. I'm not talking simply about censorship. We're always curating books, always, for our children, for our students, for our neighbors, for our friends, for ourselves, and certainly in our schools. But like, do we have the humility to receive from other kinds of people? And we're far enough away, there's 100 years, that this is another kind of people.
Absolutely.
But I think that there's the question too, Brenton, that you're suggesting there of what happens, and just seeing what people are saying, have been saying in the comments about rereading, like what we read the first time we read this and what we got out of it and what we've got out of it on subsequent readings. If it's trimmed down to this version that you have, is there anything to reread in it? Like, is there a possibility of reading it again to get a different perspective, if anything that's potentially problematic is, or in someone's view, potentially problematic, removed from it? You know, and rereading, to me at least, is the whole point.
If it had been a dramatization, like, or something, I would give it the space to abridge it and adapt it, because I like some of those, right? So in this case, like, I just returned the book, right? Like I had to rebuy the book because Ben said, why don't you come to the round table? But like, I returned the book because like it wasn't for me, like Emily, and if it wasn't this book, if it was not in a certain category of books I had, I would be probably more forgiving. But I think this is actually an important book, if I can use italics, Emily's italics on that. So yeah, so as a rereading, actually, my previous rereading was I stole someone's book off their bookshelf because they had put marginal notes in, and it gave me a chance of seeing things differently. So yeah, I do like rereading from different perspectives.
Well, perhaps the abridgment or the audiobook abridgment could, much like, the question about, these adaptations like "And with an E, Every Country in the World" on Netflix, will that then prompt viewers of that version to want to buy the book and read the book in its original form? Who knows? I began reading Montgomery because of television adaptations in the 90s, right? I didn't read Montgomery as a child. So, so that possibility is there. But in that case, I wonder, like, is it a rereading or is it an immersive experience in two different iterations of the same text? So it is now 3 o'clock. So we've kind of run the hour. So I'd like to end the formal part of the informal conversation, and to first of all, I would like to thank the three speakers. So Holly, Kate, and Brenton, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your ideas with us. There's a lot of conversation that you've generated that we're now able to have and that we'll continue to be able to think about as we move on from this. Thank you, all of you, for being here and for the questions that you have included your questions and comments in the chat. So we will now end this part of the conversation, but you were all invited to stick around for an even more informal conversation, but we will stop the recording at this point. Okay, so thank you very much, all of you again, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Before I stop recording, I would like to thank all the members of the LM Montgomery Conversations About Montgomery Steering Committee. I would also like to thank Caroline Jones for being the chat moderator today, and Benjamin Lefebvre for being such an excellent moderator. I am now about to turn off the recording button. Look for us in October with our announcements about what we'll do next month. That ends the formal part of Conversations About LM Montgomery, the Emily of New Moon Round Table. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.